Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of Maritime Conversations, where we have re upped a talk given by former Director of Maritime Warfare Center, Western Naval Command, Commodore Dr. Srikant Kesnur, on the Naval Uprising of 1946. This talk was part of a seminar on the Naval Uprising conducted by the MHS in September 21 and being shared here again for our viewers to add some perspective about that significant event in our history. This video is courtesy of Maritime History Society, Indian Navy.
Greetings and very good afternoon to you all. It is my pride, privilege and honor to come share this stage with some eminent people and give you a few of my thoughts in this session on India against freedom, largely on the Indian naval uprising that happened in February 1946. It would be my endeavor in the next 15 minutes to try and foreground the naval uprising and show how it led to hastening the exit of the British. Ladies and gentlemen, however, before that, we need to sort of give a context to what happened and how it happened. Now, the month of August has rich historical resonance. For one, of course, it marks our independence, and this year we step into the Amrit Mahotsav of our Azadi. Second, it also marks 6th and 9th August, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, which had effects then and continue to have global implications even today. 8th of August is the anniversary of Quit India movement, which too had some sense of significance for the Royal Indian Naval Uprising that happened. So I would attempt to put all of these together and see if I can bring out some sense of a story of what the Royal Indian Naval Uprising was all about. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before that, we need to delve into the Royal Indian Navy itself. It started its journey on the 2nd of October 1934 in Mumbai. It spread hugely during the war. It took part in all the theatres of war of World War II, in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, in the Arakan, in the Bay of Bengal, in the southern Indian Ocean, and despite its relatively small size, distinguished itself in many ways. Soon after the war happened demobilization and the attendant problems with that, many of which led to the uprising. And then came partition, and on the 26th of January 1950, we became Indian Navy from Royal Indian Navy. In its checkered existence of about 15 and a half years, the Royal Indian Navy saw a lot and produced, most importantly, our post-independent Indian naval leadership. Therefore, that in some ways provides the context to the naval uprising. Now, the naval uprising of February 1946 reflected in some ways the spirit of those times, the zeitgeist as we can call it, because there were a cauldron of many anxieties. There were several things that were happening at the national and the international level at that moment of time. Therefore, it is possible to indeed take a nuanced view of the uprising. It is possible to say that it had many aspects and it was multidimensional. In recent times, ladies and gentlemen, history has suggested that while the non-violent movement was the principal vector of our freedom struggle, several other revolutionary struggles and active movements contributed in one way or the other. The Royal Indian Naval Uprising would stand tall and proud amongst those movements. Now, it is my intention, therefore, to not talk about the sequence and what happened and what were the causes. I think by and large, this is known, at least in the scholarly and academic circles. It is true that in the popular narrative, the uprising does not occupy that much of space, and that sort of needs to be set right. And I suppose seminars and functions like this are one way to do so. But what I will try and do is I will try to highlight 4 or 5 important aspects of this movement, of this uprising. Now, as would be clear, depending upon your lens or your perspective, the uprising has been called various names. The British called it mutiny. We ourselves called it mutiny for a long time. The mutineers, so to say, called it a strike. It has been called insurrection. It has been called rebellion, and ultimately it came to be called uprising. It therefore indicates that there are different views that can be taken of this. So it would be my sort of attempt to give you 4 or 5 highlights which I think are important for independence of India and the post-independence Indian Navy, and leave it to our audience to sort of take a call on what they think this was all about. But before that, we have to foreground 3 events. One of these is Junagadh, that happened immediately after our independence, and I would like to quote what Admiral Satinder Singh talks about Junagadh, and it is very important. I'd like to read it. Exercise Peace, which is a Junagadh operation, he says, was the first major naval operation undertaken by independent India's Navy. It was the first time in centuries that the Royal Indian Navy did not function as an adjunct of the Royal Navy or at the dictates of the Whitehall, but as a newly independent country's nascent sea arm at the orders of the representatives of the people of the country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is very, very important. The issue is not that Junagadh was a small, largely peaceful operation. The issue is that the Indian Navy operated as an entity of sovereign India. And that is what the Naval Uprising sought to do. In 1961, Goa, the liberation of Goa, the Indian Navy fired in anger for the first time. And in 1971, less than 25 years after our independence, came the Indian Navy's finest hour. We are celebrating 50 years of that, Swarnim Vijay Varsh, when the Indian Navy came of its own and operated in both theatres and had indeed a very glorious essay. Now, these 3 operations in some way, I believe, which the quick trajectory of Navy as an advanced Navy, as a maker of its own destiny, led by its own people, had its moorings in the Naval Uprising, and that is why it's important to foreground that. Now, let me talk about a few issues that I believe are relevant to the Naval Uprising. The first, of course, while the causes were many and they dealt with pay conditions, the living conditions, the demobilization aspects, racism, I think I would like to assert that the movement was essentially political in nature. And this can be seen from various slogans: Quit India, Inqilab Zindabad, Gandhi Nehru our hero, British leave India, all of that, which had nationalistic motives and fervor. More importantly, if you will see the conversation that, for example, Punnu Khan or Muhammad Shoaib Khan, the leader of the strike committee, had with Lieutenant Percy Gorky in an important chapter called Non-Violence and Nationalism in a book that he has written, it attests to the political nature of this struggle. As Lord Sorenson himself admits in the foreword to the book, that this agitations like this fan the embers of nationalism. Therefore, if you would see the widespread support that this uprising got, the way in which it caught the popular imagination narrative for a brief time, it would suggest that it had political nature. In fact, many commentators, be it Philip Mason at that time, who served with the government of India, or political commentators as Aruna Asaf Ali or Aminu Masani, who said this agitation had nationalistic motives, I think broadly the conclusion is that there was nationalistic fervor. In fact, the demands of the agitators themselves, which asked for release of INA prisoners, which talked of withdrawal of British from several parts of the world, talk of a vision that was much bigger than their bread and butter issues. Therefore, it had a political resonance, it had political salience, and it had political impact, and that, I think, is the first lesson. The second important and significant aspect is the methods of mutineers. They were well behaved, they were courteous to their officers, they were non-violent, and except for odd case, there was no rowdyism. And that is important. And yet, because of the way they use the communication. Today we talk of social media and communication, but the clever use of communication by the mutineers, by the ratings, ensured that it spread across 70, 80 ships, 20 establishments, 30,000 people involved. As Pramod Kapoor, the author, writing, it says it spread all over from Aden to Indonesia. It spread all over India, from Jamnagar, Bombay, Kochi, Vishakhapatnam, Kolkata, all these places. And I think that talks of remarkable coordination. It talked of the clever way, the fact that they took over the ship's armories, that the fact that they took over the ammunition depot in Butcher Island. It talks to a certain level of cleverness in execution, but I think that also needs to be realized and acknowledged. The third important part, it certainly hastened the exit of British. Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister, is on record having said in 1956 that it was largely the INA trial and the Naval Uprising that led to the, and not so much the Quit India movement. He might have had his reasons to disparage the Quit India movement, but he clearly made a point about the Naval Uprising. More importantly, historian Srinath Raghavan says the Naval Uprising was probably the single most important factor that convinced the British that they could no longer hold on, that they could no longer hold on to India. And I think largely Admiral Nanda, Admiral Kohli, many who saw it, said that this in some ways was the decisive push. This is what convinced them to leave wholesale. So I think the time has come now to acknowledge that in some ways the Naval Uprising was the last decisive push, together with the uprisings or mutinies in the Indian Army, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Indian Air Force, and the general sense that went, the message that went to the British is that with the armed forces are no longer with you, you can no longer have control over India. The fourth point is that there was Indianization of leadership. This was one of the demands of the mutineers, and that is important to note, because ultimately a whole lot of Indian officers at that time were junior. They acted as critical intermediaries between the those who had revolted, the ratings, and the top British leadership. But they saw the revulsion for the leadership. They learned valuable lessons, and they hoisted them to have a more compassionate and more understanding leadership post-independent India. Almost all of those who made a mark, Katari, Karmarkar, Sobman, Chatterjee, Nanda, Kohli, Krishnan, Gandhi, many of them saw the mutiny in one way or other from up close, and I think they took their lessons. And Indianization of leadership, which was a demand started by nationalist leaders in the late 20s and led to the formation of Dufferin and IMA and much other, was also talked about by mutiny leaders, uprising leaders, and that found its real echo in post-independence India. The last point is the Indian Navy's healing touch. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I keep emphasizing this, that while there were different ways in which many people took, the Indian Navy itself understandably was wary about acknowledging, mutiny is not a thing that you would acknowledge in a disciplined uniformed service. But over a period of time, the Indian Navy gave its own healing touch. The freedom fighters were recognized, the mutineers were recognized as freedom fighters, given pension in 1971. Thereafter, in the 90s, we came to call it the Naval Uprising instead of mutiny. We recognized the two main leaders, B.C. Dutt and Madan Singh, and named Yardcraft after them, and in 2001 had a Naval Uprising Memorial at Mumbai. And this in many ways talked of the journey that the Navy has undertaken to recognize their efforts. And as I keep pointing out, in Admiral Krishnan and Y.N. Singh, two opposite spectrum leaders, Krishnan heard about the mutiny as the commanding officer of Shamsher, took his ship away and kept it away from the mutiny. Y.N. Singh was a part of the uprising in Port Blair amongst the few officers who took part. These two were different people, and yet they came together. They came together and worked together for the Navy after independence, and that talks of in the Naval Plans Directorate, and it talks of how well they did. My last 1 minute, ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I would like to argue that you need not and you cannot have one view of the mutiny. You can view it as patriotic resentment, as Lord Sorensen calls, audacious act of courage, as Pramod Kapoor calls. It was an interplay of many forces, but as Admiral Avati recollects, the great icon of MHS, Admiral Avati recollects that he was told by his Admiral Superintendent, the Captain Superintendent in Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, that all great navies must have mutinies before they can settle down to becoming great. So that is a lesson for the Navy. But for the country, I would like to, even if it seems immodest, take the title of an article that I had written calling it the unknown uprising that shook the mighty British Empire. I would like to describe the naval uprising, earlier called the Naval Mutiny, as something that shook the mighty British Empire. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take leave. Thank you once again. Jai Hind.